Welcome to Here Haas, a student-run podcast of the Berkeley Haas community. Today, we're joined by Syed Rasool, a third-year EWMBA student of the class of 2021. Welcome to the podcast, Syed.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you have a very interesting journey to Haas. I guess first I wanted to ask you about your upbringing.
So, a little bit about myself. I was actually born in Pakistan. I moved to the US when I was about a year old, so I have very little memory of that. I grew up in Jamaica, Queens. I was there for about 12 years of my life. I went to elementary school there, and once that had ended, my family had actually picked up and we had moved to Louisiana, in a suburb just outside New Orleans.
We were actually only a few days out from the election, so we can tell that New York and Louisiana are two completely different environments. How was that adjustment?
I have to say that going from New York to Louisiana is probably one of the toughest adjustments that I've ever had to make in my life. I had grown up within New York City where we had no more than two people from any given ethnicity in our school. I didn't even know what the word diversity meant. I just thought that's what the rest of the United States had looked like. We had celebrations celebrating each one of our ethnic identities. We would bring our own, like each person would bring their own food in from their home country. And the interesting thing about growing up in Queens was that any one of my friends' houses that I had gone to, almost nobody flew an American flag. Everybody had a flag that belonged to the country of their origin. Going to New Orleans, or just outside New Orleans, my school was quite diverse, but one of the things that was quite shocking for me was the reality that the Queens that I was living in wasn't the reality in much of the United States, especially in New Orleans. And I think that one of the things that I had kind of taken away, and I still reflect back on my grade school years, was that what I had thought initially when I was in Queens, where I was at a very diverse elementary school, this is what the rest of the United States had looked like. We had probably one white kid in our entire school. And when I had moved to New Orleans, or just the suburb outside New Orleans, we had, like I said, it was still a very mixed high school, but it was the first time I was making friends with people or had people in my class who were conservative, who were white, who were very doggedly Republican. When I look back at those years and I think about what the different institutions were like, I come to kind of realize that those institutions existed and were the way they were primarily because of local policy, because of the history of segregated schools, because of white flight. And interestingly enough, when my family was in New Orleans, 9/11 had happened. And this was probably, how old was I? I think I was 14 at the time. And I still remember watching all the events unfold on TV in our classrooms. And I distinctly remember what it was like in the months following that, which is our time in New Orleans was cut short. My mom was there for work. We were there for about 2.5 years. We were supposed to be there for about 3, maybe longer, primarily because of the racism that she was experiencing at work. Things that people were saying about her ethnicity, her background, her religion. My mom was a resident physician at the time. Patients would come in and say, "Hey, we don't want to be treated by you. Is there somebody else on staff?" And actually, one of her supervisors had told her outright, "This is not a place for you. Maybe you should look up opportunities elsewhere," and then helped her continue her work back up in New York. And we had, just as I had finished middle school, our family had kind of packed up and left. During high school, my family moved about 4 times. My parents were on unemployment insurance for about, I think, the full 18-month period when I was in high school. It was a very stressful time. We had faked our address to go to the high school that I was going to. And what that opened me up to being at high school, a predominantly white high school. We had a lot of Caucasian kids, but we had probably 3 Black kids in the entire school, which was a huge, huge contrast from what I experienced in New Orleans and what I experienced when I was in elementary school. And that was in a sharp contrast with the schools in our local area, which was one town over. You'd have a school which was about over 90% Black.
This is still in New York, right? Is it just a different town in New York?
Exactly. So now we had moved to Long Island. We're no longer in New York City. And being out in Long Island, I later came to discover that it is the third most segregated school district in the entire country. So when we had moved there, that was the contrast that we were experiencing. And some of the things that I come to think about at that time was how much being in a wealthy neighborhood provides you with access and resources that I would not have ever gotten had I been at another school. I still remember at that time when I was on reduced lunch, there was a sense of embarrassment that I had felt.
So hearing that and knowing that at that time you were still just a teenager in high school, how do you think that kind of shaped you going forward at that time?
There was an old professor of mine in college who had actually brought up a line that said, even if you don't care about politics, politics cares about you. And that, for me being a South Asian Muslim American male that was coming of age post 9/11, there was a geopolitical war taking place, and the battleground was my identity. I was moving between New York to New Orleans and then back to New York. This was what was happening in the backdrop, where I was hearing things about mosques in my community being surveilled, people who were being detained, oftentimes held without trial. This was what was going on in my world. And I, at that point, was incredibly, and I would say way more so than a lot of my peers, aware of political forces and what was happening around me and how that was shaping my life and how that would potentially shape my life's outcome and the outcomes of people around me.
Before moving on, I want to circle back to 9/11 and what happened in New Orleans. Did you feel like danger at that time after 9/11 occurred?
For us as a family, no. We had really good friendships with our neighbors. I think it was like 2 days after 9/11, and I used to play baseball at the local playground in a league, and I went to go practice. And one of my friends had actually told me, he said, "Hey, don't come out there." Because I think there's like people with knives, like waiting to see someone who's like, might be of like Afghani, whatever origin. And I remember I stayed home that night. There was always this aura of fear that was kind of there of could something happen. I think I had carried that with me even during my days of schooling because I would hear all sorts of comments from not just students, but teachers as well that would throw me off center and make me incredibly uncomfortable. New Orleans is a very unique place. I mean, primarily because it is a party culture. It is a city where, like, we would have parades. We'd have Mardi Gras parades. We'd go on for a month. We would have no homework on major parade nights. The Saints would win. We would have no homework the nights they would win. I mean, it's a very bizarre place. And my family wasn't just situated in New Orleans. We were between Baton Rouge and Lafayette as well. In a lot of those towns, especially my mother, especially at work, would be dealing with a lot of these issues. And for myself, I would be dealing with a lot of comments, a lot of statements from students, and I would be hearing a lot of things. Oftentimes, my own teachers would say things about my own ethnicity that when I think back on them, like, wow, you're a public servant, and this is how you're going to berate someone's ethnicity. Maybe talk about the religion publicly in class. But people loved asking me, where are you from? Most people didn't even know where Pakistan was. They just knew that it was associated with terrorism. That's what the first thing that jumped into people's heads. And it was like, you're this, but you're not black. And there was very evidently, and I would feel it, there was a racial hierarchy. And I still think back to it, the very reason my family was even able to live there and work there for the time that they did and go to school in a place like Louisiana was because of the struggles of so many African Americans and civil rights leaders that came before us. And that's something that I think is absolutely lost, is that we do owe a lot to those civil rights leaders and to their activism for our ability to operate and function in this country the way we do.
I think that's a good point. And, we see that just the recent, I guess, events of this year, right? Like with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and there's an outpouring of support, as there should be. Kind of want to use that to pivot to your involvement in the community and contributing to spreading this awareness. Did you want to just share with us some of the events and some of the activism that you participated in this year?
So this year when the events were taking place, I feel like collective trauma, when it happens at that level, it's a form of awakening for everybody. And hopefully it's a form of awakening for everybody. And for myself, it was actually bringing up a lot of racist incidents in my life that I had repressed. And coming to think about some of the involvement that I had, some of the things that I was involved in, we had a group of Hasis that were actually going out that I was kind of working with. We kind of had grouped together that were going out to pretty much every protest that was happening in Oakland. And I know that it's important for all of us to show up, very important for all of us to show up in person, protest, make our voices heard. But it's equally important for all of us to see what our skill sets are and how we can make a difference in our communities, in our society, and pick a lane. And for me, it was to get out the vote and the strategizing that I was doing for electoral politics. I was living in Texas for some time, and I was working with a local candidate with helping him get elected to the US, the Texas House. And I was
Mhm.
writing strategy for him, helping him fundraise. And for me, it was to get out the vote and the strategizing that I was doing for electoral politics here.
Awesome. So it sounds like you had a very eventful childhood growing up in New York, kind of rotating between New York and Louisiana due to obviously some events happening within the country, but also the family situation. How did you go from a teenager in New York to being an evening weekend student at Haas? Let's fill in some more blanks here.
Okay, well, you got a couple hours? 'Cause I had gone to undergrad back up in New York, and I had
Mhm.
studied political science and Middle East studies at that time. And
Mhm.
I was dead set on moving into government. I mean, I was really, really, really passionate about development. And I had kind of charted a trajectory for myself saying that as I graduate, I'm going to maybe work in the State Department, work at an NGO abroad. And, or as every idealist in their 20s says, oh, I'm going to get a job at the United Nations. And that was me. And I remembered I was charting a few paths. I was like, hey, maybe I can go to law school and take the path of being a civil rights attorney. Financial crisis had happened, and my family's financial situation wasn't the most secure at the time. And
Mhm.
I said, okay, so I'm going to study accounting. This is something that I'll be able to use to kind of help my family out if need be. And secondly, I can start earning and building a professional career right away. I looked at it from the angle of finance is a skill set that very few people have or have perfected. And given how much stress and insecurity that had caused in my home, the financial struggles that we had, I said, as I was going into this field, how can I use my financial background? How can I use that to empower communities? And that's where I started really thinking about those and thinking along those lines. And so then I had found myself at a big four with every ounce of my soul sucked out, working 80 hours a week, always at the office, never seeing the light of day.
Yeah, and I think after your career at EY, you took advantage of learning, the Arabic language and pursued an opportunity in microfinance in Jordan.
Hmm.
Tell us about that and what made you move out there.
I was incredibly passionate, as I said, about development, about politics. And learning Arabic was always a passion of mine. It was something that was connected to my identity. It was just something I had wanted to learn. And I had already done 3.5 years at a big four. My family was in a much, much better financial situation. And so I said, look, I had
Mhm.
saved up, and I said, I'm going to leave that soul sucking job, pack my bags, and go.
Mhm.
And that's the short of it. There's a lot that was happening in the background. As I mentioned, all of what I was seeing in the media, all of what was happening around me with the surveillance of mosques, people that I had known, specifically one person I had known who had gotten taken in on a false charge and was held without trial. And I have to mention this. I had a friend of mine in high school. We weren't all that close for very long, but probably a few years after 9/11, he went to join a militant group in Iraq. And later we found out a few years later, 2011, and I still remember the lunch I had with a mutual friend of ours in Manhattan. After hearing the news, he was one of two people that was killed in a drone strike authorized by President Obama. And that had kind of prompted in
Mm.
me was this feeling of I had always struggled with a sense of belonging in the United States. And so for me, it was a sense of moving abroad, moving to Jordan was a sense of me trying to understand my identity outside of all the political pressures and social pressures that I faced in the United States.
Yeah. And so after spending a couple years in Jordan, you came back.
I did. I came
Yeah.
back. It was an incredibly rewarding experience. And I say this to everybody. Me learning Arabic was one of the greatest gifts that I've ever received. Language will open the doors to conversations, experiences, and connections with other people that
Mhm.
you would never even know would have existed had you not have
Mhm.
learned that. I think that was rewarding. I think getting a chance to be in the development space where I was working with so many brilliant people, where I had gotten a chance to know people who were working as journalists, people who were passionate about solving issues and bought that with them to work every day, that was an incredibly rewarding experience. I
Mhm.
Did eventually get up and leave. I had personal issues that I had to tend to. So I was actually initially planning on going to school in London at the time, SOAS or LSE, and I had cut all that short, came home. It was also the time where I had fallen incredibly ill, and I was bedridden for about 6 or 7 months. I was in the ER about two or three, I think 3 or 4 times. But each time I got out and I said, oh, nope, I'm fine. I'm going to keep moving on. It's the whole grind culture, that the mentality that I downloaded into my mind. And I remember when I got home, I was bedridden. And I think at that moment, there was this feeling of, wow, is this it? What does my future look like? Am I really going to be able to walk again? Because it was my rheumatoid arthritis and gotten terrible. Fortunately, I recovered, but it was in that moment, in those moments, where I really started to reevaluate, well, what is it that I want out of life? What kind of legacy do I want to leave? What kind of impact do I want to have on the communities around me and the people around me? And I had always thought about those things, but being in a place where I felt like I was losing my career, I felt like my future was kind of slipping away from me in those moments. And I was getting pretty much told by a lot of physicians around me that, no, there's nothing more that we can do. You're not going to recover or recover that easily. It really made me think a lot about those questions even more.
And is that kind of what led you to think about pursuing an MBA at that point?
So when I think about pursuing an MBA, I still remember what that decision was like for me. And Haas, actually, Berkeley was the only MBA program I was planning to apply to, and the only MBA program I applied to. I was looking at policy schools, specifically policy schools, and this, and even some PhD programs. And I remember at that, in those moments, I really did sit back and think, well, if it was one thing that I saw consistently from NGO to NGO to government office that I was working with, I realized that what some of the biggest issues were to get these organizations run effectively were financial management, were organizational skills, were hiring practices. And I had kind of concluded from conversations with people that if these things were in line, these organizations would be able to deliver so much more of an impact to their beneficiaries. But I remember that was what I was thinking at that time. And I had actually gotten an opportunity with a colleague of mine that I had actually I went to undergrad with him. I'd known him for over a decade. He was starting an investment fund out in Texas. And our values aligned very well. We were looking at, okay, this is how we're going to build out a real estate practice. And we were going to use a lot of what we build out in the real estate practice to address issues of poverty, to address issues of racial inequity, to address issues of financial inclusion. And I had done that for about a couple of years. I mean, we started off with 5 properties in our portfolio, single family homes, and we were able to scale it up to 192, and that's where it is right now. And while we were doing this, we were working and advising on an agency for refugee resettlement in Dallas. We were running financial literacy classes in underserved neighborhoods, advising on some projects that they had there, and just being able to see the kind of impact that we were able to have in our communities based off of the way we structured our enterprise and the values we brought to the table made me kind of think back and say, how can I build upon these skills? And that's why I decided to come and do an MBA.
Wow, that's one of our most eventful journeys to Haas that we've heard on the podcast. I think you also mentioned that you've been involved beyond Haas, like just at Berkeley, kind of in the greater Berkeley or Oakland East Bay community. Do you want to share with us some of your activities?
Yeah, absolutely. I say this to anybody that's at Haas, is coming into Haas. When you go to Haas, you go to Berkeley, which is one of the best known institutions in the world. You have access to some of the brightest minds. You have access to some of the brightest professors. One of the things that I would love to tell students, incoming students, and students on campus now is that, look, you're at Berkeley, venture out. You don't know what you don't know. And the only way to know the unknown is to go out, sit in classes that pique your interest, but may not be necessarily in line with exactly what you're doing. I do highly encourage it, because if you are interested in, say, concepts of sustainability, if you are interested in economic empowerment or whatever it is, being outside the Haas bubble and interacting with students, be it undergrads or grad students or professors from other schools, will help you look at the same issues from a different angle. And that is what my time at Haas really bought me, was that it allowed me to broaden my perspective by just me going out of my way to experience classes and conversations and lectures and things at different centers.
Right. And I think that's a great point because a lot of the clubs where Haas students serve as senior leaders, there are students from all over Berkeley,
Mhm.
right? Like I think on Berk, like the Energy Club, the co-president is a PhD student.
Mhm.
We have STEP that connects kind of Berkeley Haas students to data scientists, to engineers, to other students in other schools to kind of form startups. I think that's a great takeaway.
I came to Haas primarily because of the heavy social impact bent. I knew coming into this at every step of the road, anything that I've ever done, from my extracurriculars to later on in the positions that I've held, there you can't think about operating a business in society without understanding the ramifications of your actions and your practices on society as a whole. And
Mhm.
since we all are a part of this societal fabric together, we all have a responsibility to improve it. I came to Haas because I knew that I can really live out those values. The skills you get in an MBA, I feel like you can apply to absolutely anything you do, from your extracurriculars
Mhm.
to your actual, like the skills are so broad, right? To like serving on a board of a nonprofit. I mean, you can see organizations with much more clarity. When you talk about organizing, I mean, the strategy course and the data and decisions course was helping me. So in 2018, I was flying back pretty much, I burned a hole in my wallet. I was flying back every weekend to work on local
Mhm.
campaigns here in Texas during the midterms. And the stuff that I was doing in data and decisions, the stuff that I was doing in leadership class, like it was all coming in handy. I could literally apply that in real time. So it's interesting. I don't even know how to frame that,
Mhm.
right? I mean, to be honest, I came here with the idea of, yes, like I knew that organizational management was important. But at the same time, like that was it. I didn't know what else I wanted to learn here, right?
And so you're set to graduate next spring.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, what are the next steps for you in your career?
Yeah, I had come to my MBA looking to deepen my organizational skills and really just take advantage of Berkeley and deepen my
Mhm.
understanding of society at large. And I think
Mhm.
I've been quite successful in that so far. And you can scroll down and listen to the other podcasts. There's a guy named Jarrett Wright, and we ran into each other at Yosemite about a year ago. Like I've been helping him out with his idea. We've been going back and forth. And actually, I'm going to be working with him in developing out some of the special initiatives at a startup bank that we're building together. That's what I hope is going to take off in the coming months.
Yeah, for sure. And then I know you mentioned some already, but if you had to pick a favorite Haas memory or experience, what would it be?
Houseboats by a long shot.
Yeah,
So much fun. What a tragedy that had to be
I
canceled this
know.
year.
I'm kind of kicking myself for not going last year because obviously no one anticipated this prolonged shutdown. So, just to wrap up this interview, is there anything else you want to tell a prospective student or even a current student maybe starting off in his or her first year?
Yeah, definitely. I've learned a lot, and I would be delighted to pass some of the things that I've learned over the years. But during my time at Haas, look, it's so important to have a plan, right? We all come in with an idea of where we want to go, but treat it as such. It's a plan, right? You got to have faith in the fact that your plan is going to work out, but you also have to have faith in the idea that there are opportunities out there that you're entirely unaware of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what's been my experience at Haas. That's been my experience throughout my entire life journey. And then, I have to say this. I mean, we are at Haas, we're surrounded by some of the most brilliant people who have worked in all sorts of different careers, different sectors, have had all sorts of unique life experiences. Don't be afraid to ask people about their life story. Don't be afraid to share what you're interested in and passionate in outside of your work life, because you'll find people who are interested. You'll find people who complement your interests, and you'll be able to learn so much from them. So definitely do that. And I got to say, one thing that's really, really important is we're all on a journey. Most of us don't have it figured out. Be in touch with yourself, be in touch with your emotions, be in touch with who you are at the current moment, and be okay and be open to changing as you're discovering new opportunities from your classmates, as you're discovering new opportunities through the classes that you're taking. and be okay with the idea that the next thing you get out of Haas is not going to be the be all end all, right? It can put you on a pathway to something else. We're all human beings. We're all growing. We're all evolving. And Haas is just another really important part of that journey. So we have to be okay with being different, but not entirely defined. And I think there's a beauty in that.
Such a great point. The point that Haas is just a chapter on this journey. Because we're all going to continue with our lives after graduation or leaving school. And though it's important for us to make the most of what we can at Haas, it's also important to make the most of what we can really at any point along this journey, right? So I think that's a great place to end. And Syed, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Appreciate you having me, and I loved sharing my story.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Here Haas. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. For more Haas podcasts, check out the One Haas Alumni and One Haas Undergraduate podcasts. We also have some blog articles from hosts and guests alike, so you can find those at www.haaspodcasts.org, which is also linked in the show notes. This episode was edited by Adam Ward. Ranjani Murthy is our associate producer. I'm Ray Guan, and we'll see you next time here at Haas.